Hi, my name is Michael Lam. Welcome to Create on Piano. In today's video, we're going to be talking about creative exploration. And what I mean by creative exploration is, given my current musical knowledge, how do I discover new things on the piano by myself? So the creative process of discovering new concepts and new sounds that sound good to you without having to read books or other music theory resources or videos or things like that. All you got to do is just sit down on the piano and then start playing and start exploring. Now in this video, I'm going to be throwing around a lot of terms and concepts that might be very new, and especially I haven't introduced in my prior videos. But the point is just to expose you to these names and concepts and such so that you're aware of them and you can ask me questions for the future. So my creative process is to ask some questions. And some of the questions are, what if I do this? And what happens when I do this? And the theme for both these questions is having curiosity and having a passion for exploration and experimentation. Now, the result could be that you don't necessarily get something that sounds good, but that's okay. You just keep exploring and experimenting. The other thing that can happen is that you discover a concept that it doesn't necessarily have a name in a music theory textbook. And that's okay. If it sounds good to you, then it sounds good to you. And you're learning this from the context of what you already know. So you don't need a fancy name for it. You just need to know how to arrive at it based on your current understanding of things. So without further ado, let's get started. So we're going to start with the C major scale. And recall the counting system or the scale degrees of the C major scale would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you can continue 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, etc. And then the other concept now I need to talk about are intervals. And there's a very precise way of naming intervals, which is basically the distance between two notes on a piano. And today I'm not going to be talking about the extremely precise way. I'm just going to talk about the interval number. So what I mean by this is that if you start on C and you're in the C major scale or in the key of C, the distance between C and D, what is that? The interval number between C and D is 2 because you count the C and then you count the number of notes between it. So C to D is 2. Another example is C to E is 3 because if you start on C and you count that, including that note, then it's 1, 2, 3. So the distance between C and E is 3. C to F is 4. C to G is 5, etc. And if you start on a different note, E, for instance, and you go up to F, that would be a second also because you're going from E to F. And those are two notes, including the note you just counted, E. E to G is a third because going from E to G, you count 1, 2, 3. So it's a third, etc. So that's like interval numbers in a nutshell. And with that basic background out of the way, let's start with our first question. So the first question is kind of broad, but basically it's what happens when I do something, and then what happens when I do that thing in a slightly different way. So I'll take a very concrete example. The question would be, what happens when I skip by X amount of steps? So ask yourself the question, start on C. What happens when I skip by seconds? So starting on C, you can go up a second, then go up a second, and continue. So if you skip by seconds, you get a scale, and this is a C major scale. Now, starting on C, you can ask the question also, what happens when you skip by thirds? So now you're going to skip by thirds. From C, E would be a third, and then G would be a third. So when you skip by thirds, you get a chord. So that's pretty cool. By asking yourself these questions, you arrive at some concepts. And it also helps you package things in a nice way as well. Now, the second question is, what happens when I start on a different note? What happens when I rearrange the notes? So for instance, on the C major scale, instead of starting on C, what if I start on D and still play the major scale, C major scale? I would get something called D Dorian, and it's a mode. So it has this kind of characteristics. In particular, it has that like sound to it. And then if you start on F, for instance, and then you go up the C major scale, you get something called an F Lydian, and it has a nice sound too. So it's that note again, the sharp fourth in this case. And then you can start on E and do the same thing, A and etc. You get the modes of the C major scale. So by starting on a different note for a scale, C major scale, or any scale, you get modes. And then now ask the same question. What happens when I start on a different note for a chord? What if I rearrange it? So you have a C major chord, right? What happens if I just rearrange it, right? You get inversions. And then that's a nice thing, like especially as a beginner to discover that. Then you can be like, hey, I can just play inversions over again. And it sounds really nice, right? It's a simple tool to play something really nice sounding. Now, the third question that I would ask is, what happens when I continue the pattern? So going back to the chord, right? Skipping by thirds, right? We stopped at 3 notes. What if we continue that, right? What if we add another third on top of the C major chord? Then we would get a C major 7 chord. And then now we're diving into the realm of jazz. We're getting some jazz sounds now. That's a C major 7th chord. There's also C dominant 7 and C minor 7. But let's just focus on C major 7 for now. And these are called 7th chords because from C to B is a 7th. The interval is a 7th. So in jazz, a common chord progression is 2-5-1. So by skipping thirds and continuing that to get 4 notes, you get a 7th chord. Now what happens when I continue that, right? Continue the pattern. Add another third on top. Now you get a C major 9th chord. And now you're also getting into nice jazz sounding things. So that's a C major 9th chord. And you can continue this pattern. C major 11th and then C major 13th chord. And if you continue, eventually it goes to C. So it goes back to the same note as the root. So you can go up to the 13th basically. So this is nice because now when I was exploring things, I could be like, you know, this is a C major 7th. And then I'm just improvising. And if you want to get technical, I'm actually going to play a C Lydian scale. So that's a C major scale. That's a C Lydian. And Lydian just means you take the major scale and you sharp the 4th. That's all it is. So I can do this. And I was just making up some random thing at that moment. So that's cool. By skipping thirds, you get a chord, then you get a 7th chord, and then you get extensions, chord extensions. So now we're going to put things together. I'm going to walk through an exercise that I actually did myself when I was trying to figure out some pretty sounding things that I wanted to play around with. The first question was, what happens when I skip by? And we explored 2, 3. Now I'm going to ask the question, what happens when I skip by fourths? So let's find out. So starting on C, skip to the 4, and skip to 4. You get something like this. To me, it's kind of like a suspension. It's a Lydian, and it wants to go to here. At least that's how I hear it. So that was interesting, but what if I keep exploring that? So start on D in the context of the C major scale. So I get this. And then what happens if I invert it? What happens when I rearrange the notes, right? I put the D on top, it becomes a G suspended 4 chord. And if you invert again, you get a C sus2 chord. So from that discovery, I realized that a G sus4 chord is related to a C sus2 chord. They're interchangeable, they're just inversions of each other. But more importantly, I discovered a sound that I liked. So I did something like this. And that's how I discovered that little pattern. And then let's just do one more thing, like starting on E, let's do fourths. If I do the same inversions, I get, a sus4 chord. And then if I invert again, then I get a D sus2 chord. So now I know that an A sus4 chord is related to a D sus2 chord. And importantly, I came up with a sound that I liked in that chord progression also. So what was cool about this process is that just by asking simple questions like that, I arrived at cool sounding things. And when you arrive at cool sounding things, make sure you write it down or at least play around with it a lot so that it gets stuck in your head. So that's this video. I just wanted to briefly touch on how you can explore creatively by asking questions. I know I've thrown a lot of terms at you and it could be very confusing, especially for a beginner, that I just threw completely new concepts and terms at you. But it was to whet your appetite and for you to ask me questions too. If something you wanted to go deeper in a future video, please be sure to let me know by commenting below. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.